Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Charity Charge Show. I'm your host, Stephen Garten. On today's episode, I am so excited to have Kendra Davenport, who is the CEO of Easterseals, a role that she has been in since 2022. Kendra, thank you so much for being on this episode.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, could you just share with us to get started a little bit for anyone who's new to your organization, a little bit about the mission of Easterseals and some of its history?
Absolutely. Thank you. Easterseals has been around for more than a century. We exist to support people with disabilities, people of all ages and all disabilities, and help them live life to the fullest, help them participate in every aspect of society, whether that means going to work or getting educated or just living in their community. Easterseals has 70 affiliates across the country who operate out of 1,400 centers, and we support about 1.5 million people every year.
That's amazing. I usually will ask kind of at the end of the episode, but more and more what I've been learning with each episode that we do, people are figuring out ways to donate or volunteer or get involved with the organization. So I actually kind of want to just start there because you mentioned the 70 different affiliates across the country. How do you engage with supporters, volunteers, people that might be listening to this that want to do more?
Well, they can go to our website, easterseals.com, and type in their zip code, and it will populate with whatever Easterseals affiliate is closest to them. We have a saying internal at Easterseals: if you've met one affiliate, you've met one affiliate, because they're all very different. They all have different service lines, meaning
I have a saying here at Charity Charge, if you've met one nonprofit, you've met one
there you
nonprofit.
go,
Yeah, totally.
exactly. So some of our affiliates deal exclusively with early childhood intervention and children with disabilities. Other affiliates have programs for adults with intellectual and physical disabilities. Others have programs for veterans who are disabled or who are trying to get back into the workforce. So it's really varied, but all they have to do is go to our website, again, easterseals.com, and they can learn about the affiliates in their area and then just reach out. There are always opportunities to volunteer and always opportunities to support Easterseals. And if they're not sure where they want their support to go, they can always donate to the national office. And then we push that donation out to our affiliates.
That's amazing. What are some of kind of the hallmarks or kind of the cornerstone? You mentioned that like each organization might look a little bit different, but as you just
Mhm.
kind of think of the general ethos of the organization throughout the years, what are kind of the some of the core principles and offerings?
Well, Easterseals was founded to help children with disabilities. And over the past 100 years or so, we've evolved and included services for adolescents and older children, for adults. And it looks very different. It depends on the disability and what support or programs an individual needs. And I think one of the most distinguishing factors about Easterseals is that we support all disabilities. So that's acquired disabilities, that's disabilities people are born with, that's rare diseases, you name it, anything that creates a disability for someone, Easterseals is there to support everything from autism to physical disabilities. And I don't think there is another organization doing all of that. And so when I said our affiliates operate differently, they operate different service lines. And generally, those service lines correlate to what is needed in their area most. One of the things also that I think is really distinguishing about Easterseals is that we fill gaps. We are the organization to which families with a child with a disability often turn because they lack access to supports in their public school system, or support that's available is unaffordable. So Easterseals really steps in, and it's one of the things I love about our organization is that we rarely say no, and we're very innovative in terms of how do we provide the support someone needs. If they're disabled and they express a concern or a need for support, Easterseals typically meets them where they are and strives to provide the support they need to, again, attend school or to live a healthy life, to gain, employment. So I think in many ways, as old as we are and as traditional the brand is often seen as being, we're very innovative too.
With you having, decades of experience leading and being very successful within the nonprofit industry, what is it personally that drew you to the organization 4 or 5 years ago?
It's kind of interesting. I think opportunity presents itself exactly at the right time in life, and
Mhm.
all the stars align. And just around the time at my last job, I was starting to think, okay, I've kind of exhausted all the tools in my toolboxes. Might be time for me to make a change. It was like those stars aligned, and someone told me about the job at Easterseals, and I initially, honestly, Stephen said, "Oh, I don't think I'd even compete well for that. I have no disability program experience. I'm not a program operator. I'm a fundraiser, marketer, comms person, nonprofit management, not programmatic in my experience." And they said, "Well, that's exactly why I think you should apply." And so I kind of laughed and thought, well, the exercise of applying for a job and going through the motions of interviews is never time wasted. I think it's always a good experience. It's a, learning experience. And I did. And the more I learned about what they needed and their desire to hire someone to help make Easter Seals more sustainable well into the future and to refresh the brand, if you will, and to expand the public's awareness of what Easter Seals is and does, because that's really our Achilles heel, Stephen. That unless you are a member of the disability community, chances are you don't know what Easter Seals does. You don't know how vast the organization is. So that's something we struggle with. So the more I learned, the more it appealed to me. And I now think that all of my experience sort of led me to this juncture because I'm thoroughly happy with what I do. I think the work is so impactful, and throughout my career, I've had the really good fortune of working with tremendous nonprofits that did great work, and this is definitely one of them. So I feel very fulfilled and grateful at this time, such a volatile time for nonprofits, to be in a nonprofit that is growing, looking to the future, innovating, and constantly striving to be more current, to attract a younger audience in terms of not only of those we are serving, but of those who support us.
Amazing. I appreciate you sharing that. I want to go a little bit deeper on some of the things that you had mentioned there, because on our programs and services side, we support about 3,000 nonprofit organizations. And there's no question that it has been challenging, right? Past handful of years for a lot of different organizations. But there's always, in any economy or any situation, there are certain leaders and organizations that figure out a way no matter what to thrive. So, can you talk to us about what are some of the things from your perspective that are helping the organization grow? And I also put it in the perspective of, I always like to acknowledge that, roughly 97% of all nonprofit organizations are under $2 million in revenue. And very much so when you talk about the different affiliates, like they're local in their communities and they know the problem best. So that's where there's that diversity of the different, offerings and programs and support that they're providing in their local areas. That's kind of the audience that we really try to cater this podcast to as well, is learnings for people that are doing things at the grassroots and the local level, but they're also trying to figure out, how do I break out? Last year we did $300,000 in revenue, and how do we make it to $500,000
Mhm.
this year? So that's some context for you, just to kind of talk a little bit about ways that you're seeing your organization thrive, and some other and where you've seen other successes from other organizations.
Thank you for that. I I think we've been at junctures like this before. I've been in the nonprofit community now close to 40 years and have worked my entire career exclusively for nonprofits. So we've seen tricky, challenging times in the past, not the least of which was COVID, perhaps.
Sure.
But there have been other times when, the country was in a sort of depressive state financially. And what's one of the first things to go is support to nonprofits. So I think you constantly need, and I continue to use this word, but you need to innovate, you need to refresh, you need to be constantly trying to evolve, to meet the moment, to meet the people where they are, and to adapt to the circumstances you find yourself in. And I think I forget who said it, but never let a crisis go to waste, right?
Yeah.
I think right now, the country and what's happening with the federal government and potential cuts and program changes and the closures of agencies like the Department of Education, those are things that have definitely impacted Easter Seals and thousands of other nonprofits. But I don't think there's time, honestly, Stephen, to wring our hands and say, "Oh, woe is me." I think we'd be better served if we dig in and say, "All right, what is working and how do we maximize that? How do we tweak and turn our attention to the things that are going really well and expand upon those things?" Not ignoring the challenges, but rather maximizing the opportunities. And I I think a lot of nonprofits get caught in this feast or famine sort of cycle where they find they don't have the capital they need to expand or move in a direction that would take them from 300,000, as you said, to 500,000. So they continue to do the same thing. That's the definition of insanity, right? You just continue to do the same thing and expect a different outcome. You're not going to change or grow. And I also think that this is again born of many years in this field. Nonprofits that operate like a business and not like a family organization tend to do better when things are most challenging. And so I think at Easter Seals, at the national office, and really across our affiliates, most of the organization is striving always to operate in that capacity as a business. Making that demands making hard decisions when they need to be made, contracting potentially. You don't want to let people go, but if it's the best thing for you financially, then you have to consider that. And I think nonprofits tend to uh, have a trouble dealing with what I call gray areas, whereas businesses don't. Businesses are much more pragmatic. They make decisions that are difficult and they move forward. I think nonprofits have a harder time doing that because their mission is often to help people and they'll do that at any cost. And as I alluded when we first started talking, our affiliates don't say no. This is part of what I'm talking about, right? You continue to say yes, 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 and then you spread your team really, really thin. So I think part of it is that you have to operate as a business. And sometimes when I'm speaking with other nonprofit leaders and often we share and help each other come up with solutions because some of the solutions are really exclusive to the nonprofit community, right? They don't apply in a corporate environment. And I'll say, well, matrix it out. What are the positives here? What are the negatives? When you see that on paper and it's black and white, it sounds like a simple exercise. Like, what is working? What isn't? It helps you make those difficult decisions. I also think nonprofits don't always rely on the resources they have right at their fingertips. Utilize your board of directors, tap into them, get to know them, and then if they can't provide you with the assistance you need or the guidance, perhaps in their network of friends or colleagues can. And I think that's universal. That's not unique to the nonprofit world, that resistance or reluctance to ask for help because it requires admitting that help is needed. But I think if more nonprofits were open to advice from external parties, it would help them clarify the decisions they were going to make. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I do think dealing with the challenges we all face, which are largely tied to money all the time, and I think that's tricky. But there are also other factors, external factors that are weighing on nonprofits now that weren't maybe a year and a half ago. So it is definitely a challenging time to operate in this environment.
When you talk about trying to figure out and, coming back to money, what are also I'm just curious at your organization, are there practical ways that maybe you go through on an annual basis to audit expenses, vendors, things of that sort?
Yeah, I think you need to do that ongoing. We take a very close look at our budget on almost a weekly basis. Now, I'm sure there'll be listeners going, that's crazy. Like, look at it quarterly or monthly. But doing it more often than not helps us stay aligned, helps also departments work together and collaborate. And collaboration is something am totally hard over on. I think collaboration has to permeate every aspect of the organization. So let me give you an example. When an organization is working really well and there is quote unquote flow among departments and people you're managing, I think you see more collaboration. I'll give you an example. If you get to the end of a quarter and one department has a permanent savings of 50, $60,000, but another department is short 30,000. You want those two managers to say, well, you could take my permanent savings and apply it there. And if I need something, in Q3, I'll come back to you. When your managers are working like that and identifying ways to collaborate and maximize their resources, then you're doing pretty well. And I think one of the things that I'm often most proud of that really is kind of an unsung win is that our departments at the national office are almost never over budget. In fact, I can't remember a time that any one of them was in any quarter over budget other than maybe a timing issue, like they had to make a large payment or something. So I think it's it's constant examination and it's It's transparency, right? It's admitting when you don't have the money to cover something instead of getting overextended. It's striving for an equitable balance between what your resources are and what your goals are and living within your means. And that's another thing. I think a lot of nonprofits get into trouble because they see the warning signs that, oh gosh, cash is short. And, this is the third quarter we've seen a downturn in individual donations, and yet they don't make any changes. They keep moving forward and like, well, this is what we budgeted. Well, the budget, it shouldn't be hard and fast if you're experiencing a downturn. You have to be willing to make, changes or modifications. And I think too often there isn't that reality gut check throughout an organization that there needs to be. I also think it helps when everyone understands what the goals are organizationally and how their department factors into those goals. And lastly, I'd say willingness to make that change. And sometimes that requires, some board intervention or just letting your board know, look, this is where we are. So we've had to change this. This is falling off the map. This is going to take longer. We're not going to achieve this year. Here's why. And then I think conversely, when you have a win that's unexpected, put that into savings or put it into, short-term investment rather than living off that funding. I think those are
Uh,
just some of the simple things nonprofits can do.
I'm always there's a lot to unpack there. I'm just curious when you talk about the short-term investments, that is starting to become, I'm noticing more and more of a conversation that
Mhm.
organizations are starting to think about, right? Because I think most of the time though, people, if there is any savings, they're just putting it in a very basic checking or savings account that's earning next to no
Mhm.
interest. How do
Uh-huh.
you think about short-term investments, or any type of investment for the organization? And how do you
Yeah,
think other leaders should be thinking about how to invest, but you are a nonprofit, and if that changes anything?
think, again, I don't wanna generalize too much, but having been in this space as long as I have, I think a lot of nonprofits, when there is a windfall, they think, right now, right here and now, we need to dump this into advertising, or we should put this into digital, or I'm going to dump this into DRTV because that's where I need the cash. And maybe those are sound decisions, but I also think you always need to take a windfall and dissect it and put a little into long term permanent savings where you can't access it, a little into short term where if you need to access it to meet your goals, you can, and
Mhm.
then a little into something strategic like, a fundraising initiative. Too often, I think people are like, oh, this is a windfall and I need it. And they're thinking here and now. And that's another thing I think that is unique to nonprofits. Most nonprofits think long term. In other words, they think right here and now. I'm working here. I'm the CEO. So I want the organization to thrive under my direction right now. But Stephen, what I'm thinking, and I wasn't initially when I first got to Easterseals, it was sort of a turnaround for the national office. We're rounding the bend, so to speak. So now I'm looking 5 years out. Okay, in another 5 years or so, I will likely not be here. I will likely either retire or move on to another job. I will not stay here forever. So if I look at 10 years and I'm in my fifth year, how do I want to leave the organization? I want to leave it more sustainable than it was when I arrived so that they're not, whoever replaces me is not an extremis. And in fact, they have reserves. And one of the things I'm really proud of is that we, for example, at the national office, we don't have a line of credit. We don't have any debt. 4 years ago, when we were really strapped for cash and when I was working with my team to turn things around to make us more sustainable, several people suggested, we'll just get a line of credit. And I think, another leader might have done that and made the first 3 years immeasurably easier on themselves. But as a fundraiser, most of my career was spent fundraising. All I think of when I think of line of credit is pressure. Like, yeah, I
Mhm.
can take that line of credit and for the next month or so, I have no pressure. But then I start to lose sleep because now I've got to pay the interest on that line of credit. So I got to pay more than I took. And I wasn't raising enough money to begin with, which put me in the position to need a line of credit. So I think if more people would just tough it out and really try to diversify their revenue, tighten up their belt. And to a point you made, which is really, I want to circle back to it because it's so smart. Look at your vendors. Look at your vendors. I remember starting a job. I won't say where it was, but I started a job, and one of the first things I asked to do was to have all the vendors a list of all the vendors. And
Mhm.
then I brought the team in and said, okay, we're going to go through what each of these vendors does. And we ended up cutting it by more than 50%. Like we had to run contracts out. It wasn't like we severed contracts with no notice or got penalties, but we didn't renew. And there were some we severed immediately. And then there were others we renegotiated. Like this made sense 3 years ago. It doesn't now. We don't need this. And I find most vendors are really willing to work with you on payment terms and on the scale and scope of your work. And that's another thing. Sometimes vendor relationships become so almost like friendships. And so you don't want to say to a vendor that's been very good to you, okay, we just don't need you anymore. And that renegotiation can be challenging. But I think, again, there's so much savings to be made in really doing an audit annually on who your vendor partners are.
That's awesome. I encourage nonprofits to do that. I do it more and more so even in my personal life and obviously with charity charge internally here as well. We're going through a big kind of audit. So I appreciate you sharing that. What I'm curious, Kendra, after hearing you speak and understanding the decades of experience you have in the nonprofit sector, what were some of the you speak and clearly act like an executive. What are some of the
I hope so, Steve.
experience? I hope, yeah. What are some of the books or things? I mean, how I'm sure you leveled up through experience, right? And I've been able to, in whatever way I've grown, my skills. I've had a lot of hard lessons and things that I wish I could have done differently, et cetera. But you kind of learn and you grow through that. But it has been really helpful when I've read a book or gotten an insight. It's like I can learn from someone else's mistakes and I don't have to go down that path. I'm just curious as you think about it, what were some of like the pivotal things and kind of how would you give advice to someone that is trying to level up?
If any of my team were listening, they'd start laughing and they'd all say the book in unison because it's one I
Okay,
harp on all the time. But Atomic Habits by James Clear.
cool.
Again, I think in the nonprofit sector, if something isn't an immediate and very evident success, we get down on ourselves and say, that was a flop. And instead of looking at something with really clear eyes saying, well, is it really a flop or is it just slow
Mhm.
to take off? I think the same mentality can be applied to improvement, right? You're not going to be able to retool or reskill your whole team to just to achieve one goal. But what you can do is help them move in a direction where they realize success by changing their habits gradually, taking baby steps, and championing the small victories, which over time add up to large victories. And I think so that book has been super impactful. The other book recently that not so recent, I guess I read it a few years ago, but it's something I think about a lot and I love her leadership style. Indra Nooyi was the first female president of PepsiCo, in her book, My Life I think it's My Life in Full. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Anyway,
Okay.
it's Indra Nooyi's book, and it's about her life and experience and how her childhood and honestly being underrated as a woman really propelled and shaped the way she approached business. And she's very candid in her book, and the best way to take it in, I think, is to listen to it because she narrates it and just hearing how everything from emigrating from India to the United States
Right.
and not having the right clothes and not really understanding American customs and overcoming each challenge, yet constantly being underrated as a female in what was a heavily male dominated industry, in the 70s and 80s is just fascinating. And I think she talks about those things and how she overcame and what she looks for in leaders now and how she shaped her term, if you will, her tenure at PepsiCo and the things she changed and modified and did. I found to be one of the best books I've ever read. And I read I read a lot. I've read a lot of Pat Lencioni. There's
Oh,
I
wow.
think
Yeah, I just last year read The Motive.
yes, yeah. So, I think there are lots of books that you can
Mhm.
read. There's lots of podcasts that are quicker. But what I tell my team, and I'm often asked in our one-on-ones. So every year, and I've been doing this for more than a decade, regardless of who I work for, I meet for an hour, 45 minutes to an hour with everyone on my staff. So sometimes that's taken me a year to do. At Easterseals, it takes about 6 months working around my schedule. But I give them 5 questions to answer, so everyone's answering uniformly, and they're questions like, "What do you like most about your job? What's the best part of your day? How can I help you? Where do you see yourself going with the company, or do you? It's all questions like that. If I could give you something that would help you do your job, what would that be? And then we spend 45 minutes or so talking in those one-on-one meetings. And what happens, I find, is that you begin to see a trend, right? There are things you learn about the culture of the organization any given year that maybe were present or more present this year than they were last year. And one of the things in those meetings people always ask me is, what do I do what's the best thing I can do to help myself evolve and develop professionally? Should I go back and get a master's degree? Should I, try for a promotion? Can I switch lanes? And I think that's something too that as Americans we are slow to embrace, right? I think you can change gears. I think you can switch lanes. I don't think you used to be able to do it as easily as you can today, but I think you can. And where all this is going is that the one thing I tell them is you don't have to necessarily go get a master's degree. What you have to do if you want to evolve professionally is read. Reading is becoming a dying thing. People don't want to devote 4 hours to reading a book in full. They want the Reader's Digest, and even saying Reader's Digest, I'm dating myself. People want an instantaneous Cliff Notes. Like, how do I get that? How do I find out what's the gist of that book without taking the time to read it? And you really rob yourself of the learning that is in just reading a
Mhm.
book. So where I tell them to start is, if it's not a book, dedicate, you know, 20 minutes a week to reading something consistently and educating yourself. Maybe not even about the field you're in, but about the world around you. There are so many great podcasts. There's so many newspapers that you can access online for $4 a month, and I think I tell my own children that read, 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 read. Please read, learn more, make yourself more interesting. And you inevitably, in doing so, you develop yourself, but you also engage people around you and find that, current events come into conversation. It facilitates an ease. If you're selling, it's a great way to break the ice. So I don't think people necessarily need to go back to school. I do think they need to read, and I write a daily message, and I was talking about this with my husband because he was like, "I just really don't understand how you find the time to do that and why you see that value in that." And he's like, "I'm not knocking it. I just help me understand, Kendra." And I said, "Well, I get up as he knows, very, very early. I get up around 4:30, and for me, that daily message is a
We're in the same
clarifier."
club.
It's a cla yeah, it's a
Yeah,
I wish I could sleep a little longer, Stephen.
I
It
say the same thing, yeah.
doesn't work for me. So it clarifies my day. It helps me share with them things that are on my mind. Sometimes it's a paragraph, sometimes I'll say 6-minute read, 10-minute read. But I often share books in those daily messages with them, like, this book resonated with me. Here's why. I highly recommend. Or this article, I'll link articles that I read in The Economist or The Atlantic or Harvard Business Review or the New York Times, whatever I'm reading, I read constantly. And I'm so grateful to both of my parents who have passed away for instilling that in me. Like, you don't need to get a master's degree necessarily to improve yourself. You need to go to a library. And now you don't even need to do that. It's all available at your fingertips.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of discussions lately with a variety of different nonprofit leaders talking about just the workforce development, the rise
Mhm.
in trades. You also look at the cost and the debt that really kids are in coming out of college.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so I agree with all of the points you're making there. I'm curious as you talk about kind of rounding out this interview, but maybe kind of thinking about a little bit of the future here. If you're following current events, as you talk about different articles and you're talking about the Economist or Atlantic, et cetera, what is your sense of AI and how that's going to impact the nonprofit world and maybe already is?
Well, I think AI is impacting every aspect of our world, and some of it is really positive, and others is really, as you know, tremendously negative. I think about how AI can expedite different processes, and I think that's phenomenal, right? AI, for example, summarizing a 2-hour meeting is time, that an EA or even a junior staffer doesn't have to spend going through, a
Hmm.
litany of notes that are, all jumbled, and it's not always right, right? It doesn't always work. You do have to do some reading. You do have to engage with a little bit. But I also think even in terms of ad development or synthesization of information, it's just super. And I find I learn more and more from people around me when they share how they're using AI. So I'm involved with this. I'm doing a it's called the Global CEO Leadership Program at Booth, Chicago University of Chicago's Booth
Mhm.
School of Business. And every week prior to class, I have so many articles to read, and even I have trouble like getting to all of that on top of work. And one of the people in my cohort said, "Oh, I use AI to synthesize all of it, and then I use that." And I thought, "This is one time I think I'll take them up on that." So I think it really depends. It depends on what you're using it for. I don't think AI is going to eliminate a ton of jobs in the nonprofit sector because the nonprofit sector social service programs like Easterseals, for example, runs very hands-on. AI isn't going to replace those jobs. Is it going to replace other jobs? Are we seeing massive layoffs because of AI? Yes, in different sectors, and that concerns me. But my husband is a researcher, and he is often asked by companies to predict what AI is going to do for them. And he says, yes, they can, they can augment and speed up your research, but only a human can parse out to a very fine degree what's going to be important for you to pay attention to. So it's not going to eliminate every job. And I do think it needs to be used responsibly. I think we're years away from really understanding all the benefits and all the detracting factors. But I do think more and more nonprofits need to pay attention to AI and how they can best utilize it to augment their goals and to advance their missions.
I appreciate you sharing that. A question that I would want to ask to kind of also put it into perspective, given your experience. It wasn't that long ago that nonprofits didn't even have websites, weren't even accepting donations
So true.
online, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I think Network for Good was the initial one to power it with their Donate
Yeah.
Now button in 2001 that really helped nonprofits for the first time accept donations online. And then obviously a whole industry was started there of, nonprofit CRM and SaaS companies and whatnot to power that. Is there any comparison to that shift or other major, like, breakthroughs that you've seen in the nonprofit industry in terms of tech and, enablement?
Definitely think our CRMs, I mean, go back
Right.
even, 20 years. You don't even have to go 20 years to a CRM that, Blackbaud sold, what, 90% of nonprofits that have any kind of direct response program. Some crazy amount like that were bought into the whole Blackbaud model, which really was just a repository for basic data, people's
Mhm.
addresses and how frequently they gave, and
Sure.
didn't even give you the demographics or the individual donation info that you really need to expand donations, to take somebody from a $50 monthly gift to as a sustainer to planned gift. So I think it's evolved at light speed in terms of use of that data, how we acquire it, how we manage it. And now even small nonprofits can have a very sophisticated CRM and engage with their donors at in so many different ways and track their response rate. But at the same time, we're evolving like that, Stephen. I think everything old is new again, right? We're going back to tried and true face to face donations. And I can remember less than 10 years ago, I was involved in a group of international fundraisers. It was this group I was a member of, and developers from different countries would talk about how we were raising money and what we were doing. And at the time, I was based in the United States, and all of the Europeans were saying, "Oh, we're all doing face to face. We're doing on the street solicitation, and it's going gangbusters." And I remember thinking, "Oh my God, Americans would never do that. They would be so affronted by someone confronting them in the street and asking for a donation." And little did I know, the bulk of the funds these nonprofits in Europe were coming from the United States. They were here in our cities doing face-to-face fundraising, and now 10 years later, there's not a really diverse fundraising portfolio among major nonprofits that isn't doing face-to-face and isn't
Mhm.
tweaking that and looking at that. So, I mean, when you look at how fundamental that is to fundraising and how long face-to-face giving has been around and a tactic, and how AI, for example, is able to model for us what that looks like across demographics in different urban and peri-urban and rural areas. It's a blend of technology as well as just basic fundraising smarts. So I think the magic is in figuring out what's going to work for your nonprofit because as we've been saying this whole hour, every nonprofit is different, every audience is different, the skill sets, the tools, the resources, the geography, it's all different. So you need to, I think, figure out what works for you and what mix is going to be most appropriate.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for that point and sharing that. It makes a lot of sense too. And I think also more so with the use of technology and having more of the better data and also just reading and thinking and using any of these tools, you can get that more individualized approach to then be able to apply it. So that's a really good point, Kendra. To round out this episode, I know we talked on it a little bit in the beginning, but tell people that have been listening about your organization and following along, how can they donate, get involved, help support Easter Seals?
Thank you. Think what I'd like people to understand about Easter Seals is that we exist again to help anyone with any disability. What I think more Americans could benefit from knowing is that 70 million Americans, a quarter of the American population is disabled. That's massive. And it's also one of those things where any of us can become disabled at any given time. We can have an accident, we can contract an illness, we can all kinds of things can happen that can then make us disabled. And so it isn't a foreign thing. It's something that impacts all of us. And anyone who's cared for a parent as they've aged can see how quickly disability services and supports can help. And I think Easter Seals exists to help people. And as I've said, meet them where they are in their communities and help them access society fully, participate in all aspects of society. And I think understanding that disability is not synonymous with inability is really important. And if I could flip a switch and have people understand more about disability in general, I think it would make for greater understanding and greater support. But I think if you go online, you go to easterseals.com and you just watch one of our videos, one of our testimonial videos from a parent or a child who's being helped by Easter Seals, it's hard not to be moved. It's hard not to see and feel the value Easter Seals brings to communities across the country. So easterseals.com to make a donation or to learn more about Easter Seals in your community or services and supports you or someone you know might need. It's all there.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Kendra, for coming on this episode. I really appreciate your time having you here and listening with all of your experience and wisdom. Definitely some good books as well that you mentioned there. I'm going to check out Atomic Habits, which I had heard of before, and then I also wrote out the My Life in Full, Ingrid Newby. So we're
Yep.
gonna check that out. Thank you for sharing it all,
Thank
and for
you.
everyone, you're very welcome for listening to this episode of the Charity Charge Show. I encourage you to continue to charge it forward. Take care.